There were 6 hours left until the first acid rain, and Caleb Dan had no shelter. The list of people assigned to Hayden's bunkers ended with the last name immediately preceding his own. Anyone not sheltered beneath the concrete would dissolve along with the streets by morning. No one spoke of it aloud, but everyone standing in line at City Hall knew it. Satellites had detected a cloud front over the ocean a week ago. Samples showed an acidity level at which steel melts like wax. The first coastal cities had already fallen silent. The radio transmitted only static from there, along with the same repeated message that roofs would hold for minutes and walls for hours. Hayden lay 300 kilometers from the coast, and Hayden had time to prepare. There was time, but there were no spots left. Inspector Holt sat at a table by the entrance to the central bunker, running his finger down the lists. He looked up at Caleb and stared at him for a long time. Then he said that a separate facility had been set aside for the botanical station's caretakers. He said it in such a way that the line behind him burst out laughing. The separate facility turned out to be an old greenhouse on Villan Hill, a glass dome from the last century, 8 meters high, 20 meters long, frames of verdigris-covered bronze and glass streaked with a century's worth of dust. Holt handed over the key and the transfer document and advised him to write a will on the back. The line laughed again. Caleb took the key in silence. He had worked at the botanical station as a junior caretaker for 3 years and knew this greenhouse well. It was supposed to have been demolished even before he was born, but the city always had more important matters to attend to. He climbed the hill an hour before sunset. Down below, Hayden was closing the shutters. People were hauling sacks and children into the bunkers. A wall the color of old copper loomed over the ocean, slowly advancing toward the city. Caleb unlocked the door and went inside. It smelled of earth and something else, sweet and warm, like the breath of a beast. He chalked it up to rotting leaves. In the corner, he found water barrels and a box of army rations. A gift from the inspector, 6 cans. He placed the barrels under the dome's drain pipes and waited. The rain came at night. First, there was a single tap on the glass, then another. Then the sky simply opened up. Caleb stood under the dome and looked up. The raindrops seared the glass and ran down, leaving steaming trails. From below, out of the city, came a sound he'd never heard before. It was the groan of metal being dissolved alive. Downspouts were falling from the houses. The tin roofs were sagging and leaking. The concrete bunkers held firm. They'd been built with a margin of safety and coated with a compound that the rain was still bouncing off. But the glass above Caleb's head was cracking. The first crack ran across the entire dome with a dry snap. Caleb clenched the key in his pocket and scanned the area for a corner to crawl into. A second click, a third. A shard the size of a palm fell out of the frame and began to smoke while still in the air. Acid had seeped inside. A drop landed on Caleb's forearm and burned through his sleeve. He ripped off his jacket and pressed his arm against the ground. The pain was sharp and piercing, and then he saw what made him forget the pain. The crack in the dome was moving. Its edges were pulling toward each other like the edges of a wound. The glass was flowing not downward, but inward. A minute later, only a thin scar remained from the crack. 2 minutes later, the scar darkened and smoothed out. The hole left by the fallen shard was covered by a film. Before his eyes, the film thickened and turned into glass. Only this glass was darker than the old one, deeper, with a greenish tint like water in a well. Caleb stood up and pressed his palm against the new section. The glass was warm. Something was beating steadily and slowly beneath his palm. He pulled his hand away and noticed that the cut on his forearm had left a bloody trail on the glass. The trail didn't run down. It seeped into the glass like water into sand. A wave of green light rippled across the dome from that spot. The wave traveled around the entire frame and returned to his palm. And Caleb felt the dome. He didn't understand it, he felt it, the way one feels one's own skin. He felt every drop of acid striking from above. Only the drops didn't burn. The drops nourished him. The dome drank the rain like parched earth drinks water, and with every sip, the glass grew a hair's breadth thicker. Caleb sat down on a box of rations because his legs could no longer support him. All night long, rain poured down on Velen Hill, and all night long, the dome grew darker and expanded by centimeters. By dawn, the rain had stopped. Caleb went outside. The path to the door had vanished. The stone had been eroded down to gravel. The railing had dissolved to mere stubs. But the dome stood intact and was noticeably taller than it had been the night before. The bronze frames were submerged in the glass like old bones in young flesh. Hayden lay below. Half the city was left without roofs. The bunkers still stood, but their outer layer had turned white and crumbled into dust. People emerged from the bunkers and looked up at the hill, at the only structure that had lost nothing overnight. Caleb went back inside and discovered the other side of the miracle. The box of rations had been opened, not by a human. The glass floor beneath the box had opened into a funnel and sucked in 2 cans along with the tin. Right before his eyes, the funnel closed, and a green wave swept across the dome once more, sated and satisfied. The dome was eating. The acid gave it the strength to grow, but it built its body from organic matter and metal. And there were only 4 cans of organic matter on the hill, and 1 person. The cut on Caleb's forearm suddenly began to throb more deeply than it should have. He unwrapped the rag. The wound wasn't festering. It was healing over with a dark, shiny crust resembling glass. And Caleb realized that the blood that had gone into the dome was not a payment, but a signature. He was now part of this structure. If the dome was sated, he would be sated too. If the dome began to starve, that is, it would start with the nearest organic matter. And the nearest organic matter on the hill was Caleb himself. He looked at the 4 cans, then at the city without roofs, then at the garden beds of the old greenhouse, where dead soil lay beneath a layer of dust. The math was simple. The dome consumed 2 cans per night. He had enough supplies left for 2 days. In 2 days, he needed to find enough food to sustain both a person and the growing structure. He picked up a shovel with a rusty handle and began digging up the garden bed. The soil beneath the dust turned out to be rich and warm, too warm for the morning. The dome was heating it from below, like a hen brooding over her eggs. In the shed behind the greenhouse, he found a tin box containing century-old seeds, barley, beans, and something unlabeled. Dead seeds by any botanical standard. Caleb poured a handful into his palm and felt, through their connection, how the dome's attention was drawn to the seeds. The glass floor beneath the garden bed glowed. Thin threads of light flowed from the light into the earth. Caleb planted the first seed in the furrow, and a thread wrapped around it right before his eyes. The seed cracked open. A white sprout emerged from the crack, and, within a minute, had grown to the length of a finger. Caleb stood over the garden bed, holding his breath. Then he planted a second handful, and a third. By noon, the garden bed was as green as in the height of spring. By evening, ears of grain had formed on the stalks, their awns gleaming like glass. The dome wasn't just growing barley. The dome was remaking it in its own image. Caleb plucked an ear, rubbed it between his palms, and tasted a grain. The grain was sweet, and a warmth spread through his body like that from hot soup. He ate and laughed, alone in the middle of the empty greenhouse. Then the laughter stopped. Through the connection, he sensed a gaze. The dome perceived everything around the hill with its skin, and the dome showed it to him. At the foot of the hill, near the ruined warehouses, a man stood looking up. Caleb knew him. It was Jarvis from the slaughterhouse, the man who, even before the rain, would take what didn't belong to him simply because he could. Jarvis stood motionless for a very long time. He was looking at the only intact building in a world where even the concrete had dissolved. Then he turned and walked toward the city with the brisk stride of a man who had a plan. The dome beneath Caleb's palm grew hot. According to the radio's calculations, the second rain was due in a day. People with plans usually arrive before the rain. When the shelters were being assigned, Caleb was given an old greenhouse, which turned out to be alive. It regenerates and grows stronger from the acid, but requires organic matter. And through his blood, Caleb is connected to it, so if the dome goes hungry, he'll suffer too. He grew his first super-fast crop from old seeds, enough food to last 2 days. The looter. Jarvis spotted the entire greenhouse and headed into town to prepare. Jarvis returned before sunset and brought 2 others with him. Caleb saw them through the glass as they made their way up the corroded road. Jarvis led the way with a tire iron slung over his shoulder. Behind him were a man with a sawed-off shotgun and a man with an empty wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow told Caleb more than the sawed-off shotgun did. They weren't coming to kill, they were coming to take things. Caleb stepped back from the door into the depths of the greenhouse and placed his hand on the warm window frame. The connection responded with a steady, strong pulse. The dome wasn't afraid. After a night of rain, the dome had become a different creature than it had been yesterday. Jarvis kicked the door and shouted that he knew about the food and the intact walls. He yelled that there were children in the city without roofs over their heads, while a single gardener was living it up behind glass. He knew how to speak in a way that made looting sound like justice. Caleb replied through the door that he would let women and children in when they came on their own, but he wouldn't let in adult men with sawed-off shotguns. Jarvis laughed and swung his own. The sawed-off shotgun struck the glass next to the door. The sound wasn't a ring, but a dull thud, like hitting bone. A white dot remained on the glass. The dot faded faster than it took Jarvis to swing a second time. He struck 5 more times in quick succession. The dome didn't even register these blows. Then the man with the sawed-off shotgun shoved Jarvis aside and fired point blank. The shot clustered tightly and knocked a hole in the glass as deep as a palm. The hole began to smoke at the edges and started to heal over, slower than the scratches. The dome was expending real energy on it, and Caleb felt a brief pang of hunger through their connection. The dome was paying for its durability from the same reserves from which it had grown. The second shot deepened the hole. The third shot pierced right through it, and the evening wind whistled through the fist-sized hole. Jarvis roared with joy. Caleb had time to think that a full-scale assault was about to begin, and he was wrong. The dome had other plans. The edges of the breach suddenly curved outward like glass petals. The petals snapped shut against the barrel of the sawed-off shotgun thrust into the hole, and the glass flowed upward along the metal like mercury. The man dropped his weapon and jumped back. The sawed-off shotgun sank completely into the glass. A green wave swept across the dome, and the hole was filled with a dark patch thicker than the original wall. The dome swallowed the weapon and said thank you. The 3 of them stood outside, staring at the smooth glass behind which there was no longer a hole or a sawed-off shotgun. Jarvis was the first to realize that they could at least take away the shards of this miraculous material. The morning after the first attack, fragments shattered by buckshot lay scattered on the road. He'd gathered them into a wheelbarrow that same afternoon, and Caleb knew about it. He also knew something Jarvis didn't. The dome showed him the wheelbarrow at the foot of the hill. The shards inside had already crumbled into gray dust. Torn from the hole, this flesh lived for hours and then died like a severed finger. The secret could not be taken away. The secret could only be nurtured, and there was only one person in the world who was nurturing it. Jarvis left at dusk, promising to return with a blowtorch and some more serious people. He didn't return. A second rain came that night, and this rain was worse than the first. The radio had managed to report that the front had hit the chemical depots along the coast and was carrying a mixture that would make the first first downpour seem like dew. The dome drank and grew. Caleb lay on the warm glass floor, listening to the roar of the water and feeling the building around him thicken and send its roots into the hill. Yes. By the second night, roots had grown from the dome. Glass veins extended deep into the earth and began drawing water and minerals from there. By dawn, the greenhouse sat on the hill like a tooth in a jaw, and in the city, the second night reaped its harvest. The outer layer of the bunkers had crumbled down to the rebar. The shelter that Jarvis and his people had set up in the slaughterhouse basement was flooded through the burned-out roof. Caleb found out about this when, in the morning, 2 of the 3 from the previous day crawled up to the greenhouse door. They were burned and without their wrenches. Jarvis had stayed beneath the slaughterhouse. The 2 begged to be let in and swore by everything that remained. Caleb stared at them through the glass for a very long time. Then he opened the door, not because he'd forgotten what happened yesterday, because the dome needed hands, and he needed witnesses. He laid out the terms in simple words: work for food, weapons to be melted down for the dome, 1 attempt at deception, and they'd be outside until the next rain. The 2 agreed so quickly that it became clear just how terrifying it was out there. By noon, more people had come to the door. A family with 2 children, an old man with a toolbox, a woman in scorched engineering overalls who didn't ask for food, but right from the threshold asked what kind of polymer this was and why it violated 3 laws of material science at once. Her name was Mara Vex, and before the disaster, she used to count bridges. Caleb let them all in. Over the course of 2 rainy nights, the greenhouse had grown to the size of a hangar, so there was plenty of room. Mara walked around the dome in a circle, tapped the walls with her knuckles, measured the scars with a vernier caliper, and in the evening sat down across from Caleb with the expression of someone whose worldview is crumbling. She said that after every damage, the dome's material rearranges its lattice structure, and that yesterday's holes are stronger today than intact sections. She said that if this is true, then the dome shouldn't be protected from the rain, but exposed to it, and that acid isn't just something to be endured. Acid can be stored. She sketched a diagram of the gutters and storage tanks on the back of an old delivery slip. The dome listened through Caleb, and Caleb didn't have to draw anything himself. By morning, the glass gutters had sprung up all along the slope on their own and converged into a thick, transparent cistern by the north wall. Mara looked at the structure that had sprung up overnight according to her diagram, and her face was like that of a skeptic from old books who had witnessed a miracle and couldn't decide whether to be angry or to pray. The dome met the 3rd rain with its gutters open. The acid flowed into the cistern, and the cistern glowed from within with a murky amber light. The dome broke down the mixture and channeled the energy into heat and light. Above the garden beds, clusters of glass fruits lit up like lamps. The barley produced a second crop in 3 days. Mara dubbed the beans glass beans because the pods jingled. There was now enough food to feed a dozen mouths and the dome. And then the rule that Caleb had already begun to understand came into play. A well-fed victory lives for a single moment. On the 4th morning, the dome showed him the way from the south. A convoy was heading toward the hill along the pitted highway. 3 trucks on acid-resistant tires and a tractor-trailer with a tanker. The sides were sheathed with panels bearing traces of all 3 rains. On the lead vehicle flew the flag of the Odo trade convoy, a man who, even before the catastrophe, had controlled half the county's roads and who never came just to look around. The convoy came to a halt at the foot of the hill. A burly man in an acid-resistant raincoat stepped out of the lead vehicle, raised his head toward the glowing dome, and stood that way for a minute. Then he ordered his men to set up camp. Odo hadn't come to visit. Odo had come for the long haul. The dome had repelled Jarvis's attack, devoured his sawed-off shotgun, and proved that fragments die apart from the whole, and Yarvis perished in the second rain. Caleb let in the first people, including the engineer Maru, who had come up with the idea of stockpiling acid, and the dome grew gutters and a cistern that provided light and heat. There's enough food for a dozen people. Odo's trade convoy arrived at the hill and set up camp. Odo began with a gift, and Caleb immediately realized that the gift was a trap. In the morning, two men from the convoy brought a crate of canned goods, a sack of salt, and a letter on thick paper to the door. Odo wrote that he was glad to see an island of order in a sea of acid and asked for a meeting, just as one neighbor asks another. Mara read the letter over Caleb's shoulder and said that this is how people write when they've already figured out your worth. Caleb went out to the camp on his own, without guards because he didn't have any. The two former men of Yarvis didn't count. Odo received him in the bed of a tractor-trailer that had been converted into an office, a desk, a map of the district with crosses marking the sites of the destroyed cities, a thermos of real coffee, the aroma of which hit him like a memory of a past life. Odo poured 2 mugs and got straight to business. His convoy maintained the last viable route between the 4 surviving settlements. He transported water, filters, and ammunition, but every trip wore down the tires and took a toll on the people's lungs. He needed 3 things: fresh food for the caravans, oxygen in cylinders, because after the rains, the air in the lowlands burned the chest, and repairs to the bodywork, if the glass material could be applied to the vehicles. In exchange, he offered everything that traveled along his routes: fuel, metal, tools, people with the right skills. Caleb listened and, through the communication link, sensed how the dome on the hill was drawing its attention to the trucks, more precisely to their metal. The dome always wanted to eat, and the convoy was full of metal. Caleb replied that food and oxygen would be provided. He'd try the plating, but living glass outside the dome dies, so they'd have to find a solution. And that he'd pay Odo not with fuel, but with organic matter, anything that rots. Waste from the battles, spoiled warehouse stock, cattle carcasses from poisoned farms. Odo raised an eyebrow and asked why he needed rot. Caleb replied that it fertilized the garden beds. That was a third of the truth, and Odo clearly sensed what was left unsaid, but he nodded. The merchant respected others' secrets, as long as they brought him a profit. The contract was sealed not with paper, but with the first delivery. By evening, Odo's truck had brought 4 metric tons of spoiled grain from a warehouse near Red and hauled away crates of fresh glass bottles and the first 10 oxygen cylinders, which the dome exhaled over the garden beds day and night. Thus began the week that Mara later called the Week of Great Growth, and which Caleb remembered through 4 scenes. Scene 1. The dome's roots reached the old city dump on the northern slope, and at night the hill hummed with the work of the glass veins grinding through half a century's worth of trash. Scene 2. In a single rainy night, a second dome, the same size as the first, bulged out of the south wall and opened up, and in the morning, people walked inside the new hall, touched the warm walls, and spoke in whispers as if in a temple. Scene 3. Mara and her crew were setting up tiered garden beds in the new hall, while the dome was constantly reworking her blueprints, growing its supports before she could even finish a line on paper. And Mara grumbled that for the first time in her life, she was designing in a race against the building itself. Scene 4. In the evening at the end of the week, Odo came to look at the second dome. He stood in the middle of the hall beneath clusters of glowing fruit. He looked up at the tiers of greenery reaching all the way to the vaulted ceiling. He watched the children running between the raised beds, for the first time in a month, without coughing. And the face of the richest man in the county did something it was rumored to have never done before. It looked bewildered. Odo took off his hat, wiped his forehead, and said quietly that he'd been hauling cargo for 30 years and thought he'd seen it all, and that he'd been wrong. From that evening on, the tone of his letters changed. The the word neighbor disappeared from his letters, and the word partner appeared. The problem came from where it was bound to come, from the greatest victory of all. The glory of the dome traveled along Odo's routes alongside crates of glassware and reached Hayden sooner than Caleb had expected. After the disaster, Commandant Garin ruled the city, the former garrison commander who, on the very first night, had prevented the bunkers from being overrun and had since held the city just as firmly as he had held back that stampede, with an iron fist and lists. People were leaving his bunkers for the hill, first one by one, then in families. Every person who left was a hole in his lists and a crack in his authority. At first, Garin sent Inspector Holt to the hill with a demand to return the fugitives for registration. Caleb listened and replied that anyone could keep the records, but the dome fed the people, and the people themselves chose where to sleep. Holt wrote down the reply word for word, and Caleb noticed that the inspector's hand was trembling, not from fear, but from the anger of a stranger forced to deliver someone else's ultimatums. A day later, Garin arrived in person. An armored personnel carrier on cast steel tracks climbed halfway up the hill. The road couldn't handle it any further. The commandant walked the last 100 meters, and Caleb took note of that. Garin was no coward. He was a man whose world had shrunk to a single city, and who confused the city with himself. The conversation was brief. Garin stood with his arms spread wide in front of the door and announced that, under martial law, all strategic facilities in the district were to come under the commandant's control. That the greenhouse, with its food and oxygen, was a strategic facility. That Caleb could remain there as a caretaker on rations. He spoke as evenly as someone reading a sentence, and behind him, by the transport vehicle, stood 6 men with automatic rifles. Caleb replied with a single sentence. He said that the dome was not a facility, and that anyone who tried to take it by force would learn the difference. Garin looked at him with the long, appraising gaze of a professional assessing a front line. Then he said he was giving them 3 days to hand over control voluntarily, and that on the 4th day he would come with an order, and he always carried out his orders. He turned and walked downstairs without looking back. Mara stood behind Caleb and asked quietly what would happen on the 4th day. Caleb watched the transport vehicle drive away and listened to the dome. The dome wasn't afraid, and that was more frightening than any threat. The dome watched the departing armored vehicle the way one might watch a meal. But between the 4th day and today, there was something else that neither Garin nor Odo knew about. That night, the acid tank began to hum. Through the communication link, the dome showed Caleb the sky as he himself saw it. Far out over the ocean, a storm front was forming, one that made the first 3 rains seem like mere drizzle. The dome had sensed it in its very being for a week. The storm of storms was heading toward the coast slowly and directly, like a death sentence. And according to all of Mara's calculations, she'd pored over the maps until morning, it turned out that Hayden's bunkers, with their corroded plating, wouldn't survive such a storm. Caleb had 3 days until Garin's soldiers arrived, and 7 until the sky. And the hardest thought wasn't about the soldiers. The hardest one was that 1,000 people in the city were trapped in concrete that would dissolve. And the man with the lists would decide who would live. Caleb struck a deal with Odo, food and oxygen in exchange for organic matter. Within a week, the dome had expanded into a second hall, and the skeptic Odo had become a partner. Hayden's commandant, Garin, declared the dome a strategic facility and gave them 3 days to surrender voluntarily. The dome sensed the superstorm that would arrive in 7 days and destroy the city's bunkers. On the 4th day, Garin arrived as promised and began not with an assault, but with a siege. Caleb was waiting for the soldiers at the door when he saw an armored vehicle blocking the road at the foot of the hill, the same road Odo's trucks used. Garin had fought his whole life and knew that fortresses are taken not by force, but by starvation. He just didn't know what this fortress actually lived on. By noon, his loudspeaker announced a blockade of the hill. Not a single vehicle carrying supplies would be allowed through. No one from the city would be allowed to leave. Supplies would resume once the facility was handed over to the military administration. Odo sent a note via a young boy stating that he wouldn't fight Hayden over someone else's dome because a merchant fights only for trade routes. But he wouldn't go up against Caleb either. He led the convoy to an old gas station 5 kilometers away and waited to see who would take it over. Merchants know how to wait better than anyone. During the first day of the blockade, the dome didn't notice anything. The dump beneath the northern slope was still feeding the roots. On the second day, Caleb woke up to a sensation he initially mistook for hunger. A subtle, vicious ache gnawed at his ribs. He ate breakfast and realized the ache wasn't coming from his stomach. It was coming from the connection. The landfill was running out. The dome had ground up half a century's worth of trash in a week of growth and was now scraping the bottom. And the halls, the cistern, and the roots that had grown demanded food every hour. By evening on the second day, Caleb noticed that he'd cut himself on a shard of glass, and the wound hadn't closed with a glass scab as usual, but was bleeding for a long time, just like a human's. The dome had started to skimp on him. On the third day, things got worse. The fruits of light above the garden beds had dimmed to twilight. The second hall felt cool. People walked quietly and looked at Caleb, and Caleb walked around looking gray with sunken eyes, because the dome was no longer drawing just crumbs from the network. Mara grabbed him by the elbow near the cistern and said he looked like a donor after 3 consecutive draws, and that if things continued this way, by the time the storm hit, nothing but a shell would remain of him. She was an engineer and thought like one. She said that since the incoming flow was cut off, we needed to find a flow that Garen hadn't thought to cut off. And she unfolded an old diagram of Hayden's city utilities on a box, one she'd pulled from the town hall archives back in the first week. Her finger rested on a thick line running from the city to the river, past Velen Hill, the main sewer line, the sewage system for 100,000 people in a century-old city. 40 years of buildup in pipes as wide as a room. Garen blocked the path above ground, while underground flowed a river of organic matter that he would never have remembered, because no one ever thinks about it. Caleb placed his palm on the glass floor and pointed out the target to the dome via the link, just as he had shown it the garden beds and the landfill. The dome understood faster than Caleb had finished thinking. At night, the hill hummed so loudly that people came out of their bedrooms. The roots ran through the soil toward the collector, ringing and crackling. Before dawn, the rumbling subsided. And then, a green wave of such intensity swept through all the dome's veins from bottom to top that the glowing fruits flared up like searchlights. And within an hour, the second hall had heated up to the temperature of a summer afternoon. The dome had reached its limit. Caleb sat by the wall, laughing and feeling the power return to the network, while Mara stared at the instruments of the homemade weather station and didn't laugh. The storm intensified. They had 3 days left. On the morning of the 4th day of the blockade, Garen received 2 reports in a row, and he didn't like either of them. The first reported that the besieged hill had been lit up like a fairground during the night, and that, according to observers, a new wave of crops had begun to grow in the garden beds. The second reported that the city's sewer system in the northern districts had come to a complete standstill for an unknown reason. Garen was a soldier, not a fool. He pieced the information together and realized that his siege was feeding the enemy through his own pipes. So he did what soldiers do when a siege has failed. He sent in an assault team, 8 men with assault rifles, led by Sergeant Bricks. Bricks had fought in 2 wars before the catastrophe and believed in nothing but armor and firepower. He was ordered to breach the door and take the facility under control without casualties, if possible. He climbed up to the dome, positioned his men, and, to start with, fired a burst at the glass above the door, both as a warning and to assess the situation. The bullets struck in a tight cluster, 8 white stars on the dark glass. Bricks waited for a shatter and a cascade of shards. Instead, he saw the stars begin to fade, not over minutes, over breaths. The glass swallowed the holes like water swallows stones, and where the burst had struck, a dark streak thicker than his transport's armor began to spread. Bricks ordered the entire squad to fire a volley. A thunderclap rang out and died down. The dome darkened where the volley had struck, and a saturated green wave swept across the entire wall. One of the younger soldiers lowered his rifle completely and said aloud what everyone was thinking, that it was devouring their fire. Bricks stepped right up to the wall. He took off his glove. He pressed his palm against the warm glass, beneath which an alien life pulsed steadily. And Caleb, standing 3 steps away on the inside, saw the sergeant's eyes through the glass. In them, everything the sergeant had believed in, through 2 wars in a row, was crumbling and being rebuilt. Bricks led the group away without an order to retreat. Downstairs, he reported to Garen verbatim that the objective could not be taken by storm with the available resources. And, he added on his own, that if the commandant wanted to continue, he should find the resources and another sergeant. Garen listened in silence. That same evening, Caleb sent a boy into town with a letter. He wrote to Garen not as one enemy to another. He wrote that in 2 days a storm would arrive, before which the previous rains would seem like a mere drizzle, that Maravex's calculations were attached, and any competent person could verify them, that the concrete of the bunkers, with their corroded cladding, wouldn't last even through the night, and that the dome would take everyone, 1,000 people, from Garen's lists, if those lists were of any value to him, with no conditions whatsoever, except one: they must leave tomorrow. The reply arrived around midnight and was shorter than the letter itself. Garen wrote that the commandant's office does not consider the alarmist calculations of civilian experts, that the bunkers have withstood 3 strikes and will withstand a 4th. That spreading panic during wartime is a crime, and that any resident who left the shelters before the lockdown was lifted would be considered a deserter, with all the consequences that entailed. Caleb read the letter aloud. Mara covered her face with her hands, and beyond the glass to the south, on the horizon, the sky had taken on the color of old bronze by nightfall and remained that way, refusing to grow darker. The storm was approaching ahead of schedule, and 1,000 people were trapped beneath concrete that wouldn't survive it, by order of a man who confused the city with himself. Garen blockaded the hill, and the dome began to starve, drawing strength from Caleb, but its roots reached the city's sewer system and found an inexhaustible supply of energy. Sergeant Bricks's assault team failed because the dome absorbed the bullets and grew stronger, while Bricks, shaken, refused to continue. Garen dismissed the warning about the superstorm and forbade residents from leaving the bunkers under threat of punishment. The storm would arrive earlier than expected. The storm came at dawn, and its first blow was not rain, but darkness. A wall the color of oxidized copper swallowed the sun in 10 minutes, and night fell over the county in the middle of the morning. The wind carried a scent that people remembered from the worst rains, only 100 times thicker. Sirens wailed in Hayden's bunkers. On Velen Hill, the dome hummed with its entire body, low and powerful like an organ before the first note. Caleb stood in the center of the old hall with his palm on the support beam and saw the storm just as the dome saw it, not as a cloud, but as a mountain of acid, towering as high as the stratosphere, advanced on the city at a pedestrian's pace. And it was this unhurriedness that was the most terrifying. It was in no hurry to get anywhere because there was no escaping it. The first drops struck like hammers. Then the sky came crashing down onto the earth in its entirety. The dome drank. The gutters roared. The tank glowed amber, so bright it hurt to look at it. The glass was thickening before their eyes, and Mara screamed through the roar, pointing at the walls to show that the buildup was occurring at a rate of millimeters per minute and that nothing like this had ever happened before. But Caleb was listening to something else. A sound was coming through the communication line from down below in the city. A faint sound, multi-voiced. The concrete of the bunkers was singing under the acid at its limit, and this song was growing shorter with every hour. By noon, the observer on the south wall screamed. The outer wall of the distant bunker by the river had collapsed inward, and figures rushed out of the breach into the downpour. They ran up the slope toward the dome, and the acid lashed at them, and Caleb realized that not all of them would make it to the door. And then he did what he'd been thinking about for 3 days, but hadn't dared to do. He lay down on the floor and sent not a command, but a wish to the dome. Everything, in its entirety, to descend, to reach it, to cover them. The dome froze for a single breath. And then Velen Hill shuddered. Roots tore from the ground all around with the roar of a collapsing forest. Glass veins as thick as columns tore themselves from the soil, curled into springy arches, and rose beneath the base like legs. The people inside fell, clutching at the garden beds. Dishes flew through the air. Mara clung to the frame, laughing and crying at the same time. The dome took its first step. The support arches dug into the slope further down the hill, pulled the structure upward, and repositioned themselves. Second step. Third, the transparent city, weighing thousands of metric tons, moved down the hill through a wall of rain, with acid lashing at it point blank, only fueling it as it moved. People fleeing the collapsed bunker saw through the downpour a mountain of light coming toward them, and some fell to their knees, right into the searing mud. The dome reached them, opened an arch with a canopy in its lower wall, and drew every single one of them into the warmth and light. And then it moved on, toward the central bunker, to where 1,000 people sat behind the concrete, along with the commandant and his lists. It hovered over the bunker's main entrance, like a hen over her eggs. It covered the descent with a canopy, and through the external veins, Caleb heard hundreds of fists pounding on the door inside the concrete, along the staircases. The door held firm to the order. It held firm exactly until the first stream began to flow from the ceiling of the lower level, corroding the railing to a froth. Then the door was simply torn out from the inside. People walked under the canopy in a continuous stream for an hour, then another, then a third. Inside, the dome revealed new arches directly above the heads of those walking, and Mara was no longer drawing, but merely directing the streams, shouting in a hoarse voice where the sleeping levels were and where the infirmary was. Sergeant Bricks was the last of the soldiers to emerge from the bunker. He was carrying a stranger's elderly man in his arms, and his assault rifle hung barrel down. At the archway, he caught sight of Caleb, nodded once, and with that nod renewed his oath. Garen did not come out until dusk. He sat in the empty command deck, poring over his lists until the water reached the table. 2 soldiers led him out by the arms. The water was already knee-deep in foam, and the dome let him in just as it had let everyone else in. The commandant stood in the warm light among the thousands of people he had saved, but who were now locked away, gazing at the transparent vaults above his head. No one approached him. They did not turn away from him. They simply stopped seeing him. And for a man who had come to identify the city with himself, this was a punishment more terrible than any other. The storm raged for 2 more days. The dome digested it, standing over the dead city, and grew not by halls but by entire neighborhoods. Inside, field kitchens smoldered with acid-fueled heat. Glass bottles were fed into the cauldrons straight from the tiers. Children slept haphazardly on the warm floor, and for the first time since the disaster began, no one counted the remaining cans. On the 3rd morning, the rain subsided to a drizzle, and the sun broke through the brown clouds. People stepped out beneath the arches, looked through the clear, acid-washed glass at the dissolved Hayden, and remained silent. The city was gone. The city was here, transparent, alive, standing on the curved arches of its supports in the middle of a dead plain. The victory was complete, and by all the rules of this world, which is precisely why Caleb didn't sleep the night after the storm. He sat by the outer wall and counted the new obligations. 1,400 mouths. The dome would feed them, but the dead city's reservoir would soon run dry, and the living city would have to move on. To search for dumps, ruins, poisoned farms, grazing across the dead land like a herd. And you can't hide a glowing wonder the size of a city block as it moves across the plain. It's visible 30 kilometers away at night. The answer to this came before dawn. First, the radio came to life on the convoy's frequency. Odo was calling Caleb personally, and the merchant's usually even voice was dry and rapid. He said that his long-distance caravan drivers had relayed news from the south, that the core enclave had heard about the self-regenerating structure near Hayden a week ago. Caleb asked what core was, because it wasn't marked on Mara's maps. Odo replied briefly. As for the disaster, it was called a corporation with its own army. Their underground production complex had survived, and they had already declared all anomalous materials across the region their property by virtue of being the first to discover the technology, and that the expedition had set out for Hayden 3 days ago, before the storm. Caleb wanted to ask how much time they had, but didn't get the chance. The dome answered first. A wave of pain shot through the communication link. It wasn't hunger or a wound, but a pain of an unfamiliar kind. Dome was looking south through the external viewports, and Caleb looked along with him. On the dawn horizon, beyond the dead plain, a column was moving. Low, wide vehicles advanced in a steady formation, their armor not gleaming, but taking on a matte gray sheen in the first light. The dome wasn't afraid of bullets, acid, or fire, but it looked at these vehicles the way a beast looks at the scent of a trap made of its own metal. Caleb stood with his palm pressed against the trembling wall and realized two things at once. That someone more formidable than the commandant with his lists was coming for them. And that, for the first time since that first rainy night, his dome was feeling something akin to fear. During the superstorm, the dome tore its roots from the hill, rose onto its supports, and walked for the first time. It rescued those fleeing the collapsed bunker, sheltered the central bunker, and took in 1,000 residents, while the broken Garen lost power without a single shot being fired. Hayden washed, and the living, transparent city now stands on the plain with 1,400 residents, whom it will soon be unable to feed on the spot. From the south approaches an armored column from the core enclave, which has declared the dome its property, and for the first time, the dome feels pain and fear at the sight of their vehicles. The core convoy stopped a kilometer from the dome, and its first move was silence. The vehicles formed an even semicircle and cut their engines, and for an hour, a silence hung over the plain that Caleb could feel in his skin. The dome trembled. Not from the blows, but from the anticipation of them. The outer vanes stared at the gray vehicles, and a continuous, faint alarm signal, the likes of which had not been heard during the assault on Bricks or the superstorm, flowed through the communication link to Caleb. Mara stood next to the binoculars and listed aloud what she saw. 8 heavy transporters on 6 axles, 2 platforms with lattice towers covered in tarpaulin, a tanker, a communications vehicle with a cluster of antennas, and not a single person outside. Cora's people didn't go out into the open, even in a drizzle. An hour later, a calm female voice came over the general call channel. The voice identified herself as Dr. Ilsa Rem, head of the core Enclave's field expedition, and requested negotiations with the person in charge of the anomalous object. She pronounced the word requested, as one would say ordered. Caleb went out alone. Bricks wanted to give him 2 of them armed, but Caleb refused because 2 men with assault rifles facing the convoy weren't security. They were a provocation. He walked a kilometer across the desolate plain, feeling the dome's gaze following him from behind until his very last step. An open platform with a canopy drove out from the convoy to meet him. Two people stood on the platform. A woman in her 50s, wearing a white field jumpsuit and holding a tablet, and an officer in gray body armor without any insignia. The woman turned out to be Rem. She introduced the officer as Captain Cern, and he didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. Rem spoke without making threats, and that was worse than threats. She said that the core enclave had detected an anomalous, self-regenerating material in Hayden County a week ago, based on samples purchased from looters. She explained that, according to the Enclave's charter, any technology exceeding pre-war standards was subject to confiscation and study for the sake of the species' survival, that the object would be expropriated with compensation, that the object's caretaker was being offered a consultant contract with full board in the underground complex. She was flipping through her tablet as she spoke, and Caleb realized that for her, this conversation was a formality before the procedure. He replied calmly. He said that the object was not a material object, that the object was alive, and that living things are not expropriated. One negotiates with them. For the first time, Rem looked up from her tablet. She repeated the word alive with the intonation of someone who had just heard an amusing superstition from a native. And she proposed a simple test. The expedition would take a tissue sample using a non-destructive method. If the object truly exhibited signs of being a living organism, the protocol would change. Caleb knew that refusing meant they would take the sample without asking, so he agreed to stay nearby. The platform pulled up to within 100 meters of the dome, and the tarp covering one of the lattice towers was removed. The tower unfolded like a flower made of gray petals, and a bluish rod glowed inside it. Rem called it a resonance separator, and explained that the device was tuned to the frequency of the lattice's vibrations from the marauder's cart. The dome screamed before the tower even started working. The scream didn't come as a sound, but through the communication system, and Caleb doubled over in the middle of the plane. The bluish rod hummed, and a circle 1 meter in diameter took shape on the dome's wall. Inside the circle, the glass ceased to be glass. It turned gray and froze, and a spasm ran along the edge of the circle that everyone could see. The dome tried to heal the gray spot, but couldn't reach it with its own flesh, just as a tongue cannot reach a numb cheek. A manipulator from the platform cut a plate from the dead circle and placed it in a container. The tower went dark, and in that very second, the gray circle on the wall came to life and was overrun by a furious dark wave thicker than armor. The dome didn't just close the wound. The dome around the wound reorganized itself, and Caleb could feel the very pattern of vibrations changing within his body. Rem stood by the monitor where data from the sensors on the wall was being fed, and Caleb saw her face in profile. The face of a person whose graph was creeping where graphs shouldn't creep. She looked at the regeneration curve, then at the resonance frequency curve, then back at the dome. The tablet in her hands dropped. She said quietly, no longer to Caleb, but to herself, that the grid was migrating, that the material was moving away from the separator's frequency like a beast fleeing a trap. That materials don't behave that way. That's how an immune system behaves. She turned to Caleb and, for the first time during their meeting, looked at him as a source of information rather than as an accessory to the object. And she asked how long ago the object had begun to react to him personally. Caleb didn't answer. Rem nodded to herself, jotted something down, and uttered a phrase that sent a chill down Caleb's spine. She said that the subject's classification was changing from anomalous material to bioactive. That for a bioactive, protocol calls for the removal of the control system's core, and that, according to all telemetry data, the control system was now standing right in front of her, wearing the caretaker's old jacket. She wasn't threatening or arresting him. She was simply reporting the facts. The expedition broke camp by evening and moved 10 kilometers away to the ruins of the grain elevator, where they set up a fortified camp. Before leaving, Rem handed Caleb a sealed envelope. Inside the envelope was an Enclave contract in his name with an open amount and a single photograph. The photograph showed an underground hall with shelves, and on the shelves, in nutrient baths, stood gray plates. Dozens of plates. Core had been cutting samples for quite some time, and the samples Core had didn't die like they did in Jarvis's truck. Core had learned how to feed the dead. On the back of the photograph, a handwritten note read that the living were more interesting than the dead, but the Enclave knew how to work with both. That night, Caleb called a meeting. Mara, Brix, and Odo, who had come from the gas station as soon as the convoy had left, were there, along with Garen, whom Caleb had summoned personally because the man with the lists knew more about sieges than anyone else present. He laid an envelope on the table and recounted the day's events. Mara said that the dome had shifted the resonance frequency, but Core would recalculate the settings based on a fresh sample within a week. Brix said that the camp by the grain elevator wasn't a staging area, but a bridgehead, and that there were 2 towers covered with tarps on the platforms, but only one was operational. Odo said that his scouts had spotted Core's second convoy on the southern route, heading this way with heavy tractor trailers. Garen remained silent longer than anyone else, and then uttered his first useful word since they'd met. He said that a stationary fortress against a besieger with resources is always doomed, and that this fortress, unlike any fortress in history, has legs. Everyone looked at Caleb. Caleb placed his palm on the warm vein and asked the dome if it was ready for a long journey. The dome responded with a wave of such power that the glowing fruits flickered throughout all the halls. The decision was made before dawn. The living city set out on its nomadic journey while Core recalibrated the frequencies. All that remained was to choose a direction, and Caleb already knew which one. On an old map of the district, Mara had circled the abandoned town of Red, with its warehouses, grain elevators, and depots. A city of food for the city that eats. But Core's camp lay between Red and the hill, and the only way to bypass it was through the salt marsh, which had turned into an acidic quagmire after the rains. The dome said over the comm that the swamp was food. Caleb folded the map and smiled for the first time in a week. Cora's expedition, led by Dr. Rem, had used a resonance tower to carve out a sample of the dome, and based on the regeneration response, Rem realized that the object was alive, and that its control core, which Caleb had identified, was to be seized. After contact, the dome shifted its resonance frequency as a defense mechanism, but Cora will recalculate the settings based on the fresh sample. A second column of Cora is approaching the elevator. The council decided to lead the city on a nomadic journey toward Dead Red through the acidic swamp. The city rose onto its supports at 4 in the morning, and Caleb would forever remember the faces of the people at that hour. 1,500 people sat on the warm floor, holding on to the garden beds and the rope handrails stretched out by Brix's crew, listening as the arches beneath them awoke. The first step rocked the halls like a ship's deck. A child cried out somewhere and immediately laughed because the glowing fruits swayed overhead like lanterns at a festival. The city set off. Caleb later recalled the first week's journey in 4 scenes because no one could have held on to the memory day after day. Scene 1. An acidic swamp on the salt marsh. The dome sank into it up to the knees of its arches and remained there for a day, drinking the swamp dry through its lowered veins, while people stood by the transparent floor and looked down at the brown sludge like passengers on a ship gazing into the depths. By evening, the swamp had turned into a crust of salt, and the dome's tanks were filled to the very top with amber. Scene 2. A nighttime crossing through the Delry Hills, where there was no road at all. The dome moved along an azimuth, repositioning its arches across ravines, and Mara and her team marked its path with lanterns from the roof like pilots, while Garen, down below in the new hall they'd named the station, kept track of the cargo's securing points, and for the first time, his list saved not order, but tableware. Scene 3. Costa's abandoned farm, where hundreds of metric tons of feed had gone sour in the silo pits. The dome hovered over the pits and ate for 2 days straight, while the children watched dark streams flow upward through the transparent veins of the floor and coined the word lunch for it. Scene 4. The morning when Red's grain elevators appeared on the horizon, and the entire city gathered at the southern wall and fell silent. Red was great. Red was dead, and Red was full of food for years to come. Eyes followed them the whole way. Cora's drones hovered over the nomadic camp, taking turns, and Bricks counted them at a rate of 4 per day. Odo, with his convoy, traveled parallel to them along the old trail, trading with the encampments at their stopping points, and his radio was their only window to the outside world. News from that window came in fits and starts. Cora's second column reached the grain silo and came to a halt. The first column set off and moved north toward Red, but slowly, because the heavy platforms were getting bogged down on the eroded roads. Rem contacted him twice, offering Caleb a contract both times, and both times he didn't respond. On the 5th day, what Caleb had been waiting for and fearing happened. Cora's drone descended over the encampment within line of sight, and a thin, bluish beam struck from it. Not a tower, but a handheld version of the separator. The beam traced a gray streak across the dome's wall, and the dome howled over the radio as the streak withered before their eyes. And then the howl cut off. The dome shifted its frequency a second time on the fly, and the beam glided across the glass without a trace, like a flashlight. The drone hovered for another minute, filming, and then flew away. Mara, who had seen everything from the roof, came down to Caleb with her calculations and said something that was both wonderful and terrifying. The dome had adapted to the beam in 90 seconds. The first time, at the Wall of Valan, the adaptation took hours. The dome learned to defend itself with every contact, just as the immune system learns. But every contact gave Cora a fresh record of a new frequency, which meant that Cora was learning too. It was a race between 2 students, and one of them had laboratories and shelves full of living specimens. They entered Red on the 7th day. The dome positioned itself at the main freight station between the grain elevators and the depot, extending its conduits into the basements, warehouses, and the city. And for the first time since the start of the nomadic journey, the city breathed a sigh of relief. There was enough food lying around to last 2 years. Grain, both sour and unspoiled. Fat in the oil refinery's tanks. Thousands of metric tons of metal in the depot for the glass structure. People came out under the awnings, wearing protective capes sewn from the dome's discarded membrane, and began unloading the warehouses, while Garen directed the loading operations so effectively that even Bricks acknowledged his worth. For 3 days, Red was a celebration. On the 4th day, the celebration ended according to a schedule that Caleb already knew by heart. First, Odo brought news from the southern route that Cora's first column was not heading toward Red. It had turned toward the Tarn River and come to a halt at the bridge. Then Odo, the long-distance caravan driver, reported that Cora's vehicles, equipped with lattice towers, were stationed at the northern exit of Red, on the highway leading to the coal mines. Then Bricks climbed up to the observation deck with his binoculars and came back down with the look of a veteran soldier who had recognized a familiar pattern. He spread a map out on the table and placed 4 stones on it. The bridge over the Tarn to the south, the towers to the north, the overpass to the west, blown up during the disaster, and the only open road to the east, leading to the old Garth quarries. Bricks said this wasn't a blockade. Blockades are set up all around. This is a corral. The herders block off 3 sides and leave the beast a single, wide open path, and the beast runs right into the trap where they're waiting. He'd fought 2 wars and was rarely wrong about such things. Mara overlaid the terrain on the map and added that the Garth quarries were a basin 40 meters deep with a single wide exit, and that no one could have drawn a better trap for a creature that couldn't jump. The council pored over the map until nightfall. Heading south through Tarn meant storming the bridge beneath the towers. Staying in Red meant waiting for Cor to pull back both columns and all the shelving from his laboratories and overwhelm the frequency race with sheer numbers. Going east meant walking into a pen with your eyes wide open. Caleb listened to the arguments, his hand resting on his vein, and sensed that the dome was not afraid. The dome was devouring red and growing, and in its sated calm, Caleb glimpsed the answer that no one at the table had yet voiced. He asked Mara to retrieve the pre-war plans for the quarries. Mara found them in the railroad office archives by midnight, and when she unfolded the sheet, she fell silent mid-census. Beneath Garth's bowl ran the tunnels of the old mine, kilometers of tunnels, and according to the plan, one of them cut straight through the hills to the north, 3 kilometers behind the Cora Towers. The dome couldn't jump. But for some time now, the dome had been very good at digging. Caleb circled the tunnel with a pencil and told the council that the beast would go into the pen. The herders would do well to ask the beast what it had been before it became a beast. It had been a root. At dawn, the city of Red was left behind, and the living city moved eastward along a beautiful, open road. Cora's drones escorted it all the way to the junction leading into the basin, and Caleb hoped that the operators behind their screens were satisfied with how obediently the prey was following. The city moved like a nomadic caravan through the marshes and hills to the dead city of Red, feeding along the way, and the dome had learned to shift its frequency against the manual separator in a minute and a half. But every encounter teaches Cora something too. In Red, there were reserves to last for years. However, Cor had cut off the south, north, and west, setting up a corral with a single road leading east into the basin of Garth's quarries. According to pre-war plans, there was a through tunnel beneath the quarries leading to the rear of Cor's towers, and the council decided to walk into the trap intentionally. The Garth basin snapped shut on the 3rd day of the standstill, and it snapped shut beautifully. The dome stood at the bottom of the excavation, consuming the piles of old ore, and it was clear to all of Cor's observers that the mining operation was feeding and in no hurry to leave. On the 3rd night, searchlights flared up all at once along the rim of the basin, 12 points in a circle. Bricks counted aloud from the roof, and his voice grew drier with each number. 12 lattice towers stood around the entire perimeter, and the bluish rods within them flared to life one after another. Cor hadn't brought just 2 towers. Cor had brought everything he had, and at 4 in the morning, all 12 came online at once. The dome had never seen anything like this. It could outmaneuver a single beam by shifting its frequency every 90 seconds. 12 beams from 12 directions struck at 12 different frequencies, and as the dome moved away from one, 11 others caught up with it. The walls turned gray in patches. The spots crawled across the glass like leprosy, sometimes fading, sometimes flaring up again. The glowing fruits dimmed in all the halls at once, and through the connection, a pain of such intensity surged into Caleb that he woke up on the floor of the station hall with a busted eyebrow and Mara standing over him. The dome wasn't dying. The dome was struggling. The resonance network wasn't killing him, but holding him, just as the 12 arcana hold a beast. And the dome was expending everything it had consumed in Retta just to keep him contained. His growth had stalled. Regeneration was barely creeping along. The veins lowered into the tunnel beneath the northern side had advanced 20 meters overnight instead of the planned 300. The escape plan came down to simple arithmetic. Digging under the grid meant digging for a month. There was a week's worth of organic supplies in the basin. And on the ridge, Cora's main forces were already setting up camp. Among the machines, Brick spotted a living module marked with a white laboratory label. Rem had come to work in comfort. She came on the line at noon and spoke in the voice of a doctor delivering a diagnosis. She said that the network was configured across the full spectrum of samples, and that lattice migration within the network was mathematically impossible. She added that the facility would be maintained until it was exhausted, after which a planned dismantling of the periphery would begin while preserving the viable core. that people are guaranteed an exit corridor and admission to the Enclave's working levels based on quotas, and that Caleb personally, as the Corps' interface, is being offered one final contract, after which he will be designated as confiscated property. Caleb turned off the radio and sat in silence for a long time. And that evening, something happened that neither he nor Rem had expected. A woman in a white jumpsuit approached the southern edge of the basin with her hands raised and a backpack, asking to be let in. It wasn't Rem. It was her chief engineering assistant, a woman named Lan, a quiet woman in her 30s, whom Caleb had seen on the platform by the monitor. Brix checked her 3 times for weapons and transmitters before letting her near Caleb. Lan spoke for 2 hours, and her story set the world on a different course. She had come because she had seen anomalies in the telemetry that no one but her and Rem had noticed. The network was keeping the dome at its limit, but that limit was slowly creeping higher. The dome could adapt even to the full spectrum, just not in minutes, but in weeks. Rem knew this and was rushing the dismantling. And Lan had also come because of the archive. While preparing the spectra, she'd been digging through the Enclave's pre-war materials and found the Garden Project folder. Before the catastrophe, Core was not an army with factories, but an atmospheric engineering corporation. Core built oceanic carbon sequestration platforms, and one of the platforms, named TARS, malfunctioned a month before the first rains. The platform's reactor colonies mutated and began releasing an acid-forming aerosol into the atmosphere. It was too late to stop the process. The rains were not a punishment from the heavens. The rains were a production accident caused by Cora, and the TARS platform was still operating to this day, standing in the ocean and spawning one storm front after another. And each subsequent front was stronger than the last because the colonies on the platform continued to mutate. The superstorm that killed Hayden was not the peak, but merely a stepping stone, and Project Garden was the bottom of the folder. Cora's consultant on the platform's biomaterials was a professor of botany named Oren Velen, that very same Velen after whom the hill above Hayden was named, where, a century ago, the professor had built an experimental greenhouse. Velen had foreseen the accident scenario and proposed symbiotic architecture to the corporation, buildings that grow faster than the environment can destroy them. The corporation shut down the project as unprofitable, wrote off the prototype on the hill, and forgot about it. Velen died long before the rains. His prototype lay dormant for 100 years under a layer of dust, subsisting on a meager ration of fallen leaves, and awoke only when food began pouring from the sky. The dome was no anomaly. The dome was a response designed for this catastrophe by the man who had predicted it. And Rem did not build the resonance separator from scratch. In Sada's folder lay the protocols for emergency shutdown of the prototype, compiled by Valan himself in case of uncontrolled growth. Core shut down the dome using the key provided by its own creator. That's why the dome looked at the gray machines like a beast staring at a trap made of its own metal. The trap was, in fact, made of its own metal. Caleb listened, and fragments of the year came together into a picture that made him want to howl and laugh at the same time. Mara asked Lan the most important question. Is there a limit to jamming in Valan's protocols? Lan nodded. Valan wrote that a mature organism would learn to modulate its own carrier frequency at will, and then jamming would become impossible in principle. Rem had read that passage. That's why Rem was in a hurry. The dome standing within the network was a teenager being held back by 12 adults, but the teenager was growing. The only question was, who would get there first, the showdown or maturity? Mara took the copies of the spectra from Lan, sat down to analyze them, and worked through the night without sleep. By the next evening, she went to Caleb with a single sheet of paper and said that one could mature faster if there was a teacher. The network holds the dome because the dome evades frequencies blindly, using a brute force method. But if one knew all 12 frequencies in advance, one wouldn't have to flee across the spectrum, but could instead construct one's own carrier wave wave in the dead zone between them. The spectra lay on the table. The dome now had a teacher. All that remained was to find a way to give the dome time to reconfigure, because according to the calculations, reconfiguration required 6 hours of rest, and the network didn't grant a single minute of rest. And then Garen spoke up. The man with the lists looked at the map of the basin and spoke slowly, as if at a staff briefing. The grid is powered by 4 power stations on the ridge. The stations are connected by a cable laid along an old drainage ditch. The ditch runs above the tunnel, which already contains 20 meters of glass filaments. The dome can't dig quickly. But the dome doesn't need to dig quickly. The dome just needs to reach a single cable with a single thin filament. The lights on the ridge won't go out forever. It will take Cora 4 to 8 hours to activate the backup lines if it's at night and during a thunderstorm. Mara looked up from her calculations and said that, according to Lan's weather data, a moderate strength front would arrive in 2 days. Everyone looked at Caleb, and Caleb placed his palm on the tarnished wire and transmitted the entire plan to the dome. The dome remained silent for a long time. Then, a faint green wave, the first in a week, rippled across the dead gray patches on the walls. The teenager agreed to grow up overnight. Core sealed the dome inside Garth's bowl with a network of 12 resonance towers, and the dome is struggling, expending all its energy to hold its ground, while Rem prepares for a showdown. The defector, Lan, revealed the truth. The rains are the result of an accident at the Koratar's ocean platform, which continues to generate increasingly powerful weather fronts, while the dome is Professor Welland's prototype, created to counter this catastrophe, and Core is jamming it using Welland's own emergency protocols. A mature dome will be able to modulate its frequency at will and will become impossible to jam. Escape plan. Use a thin wire through the tunnel to cut the tower's power cable during the storm, and during the hours of darkness, retune the carrier frequency according to Lan's spectra. The storm arrived exactly as Lan had calculated, and was average by the world's new standards. That is, the kind of storm that would have prompted a nationwide evacuation 5 years ago. A double night fell, stormy darkness from above, and Cora's network of searchlights along the ridge from below. The dome had been consuming the last of what remained in the basin all day, and by midnight, the thin wire in the tunnel began to move forward. Caleb lay on the floor of the station hall, his palms on the support beam, guiding it as one would guide a needle through a stranger's body. The network pressed down, and the vane crept forward a meter at a time, pausing to rest after each surge. It took 4 hours to cover 200 meters. Above, a downpour lashed down. The towers hummed, and Cora's camp slept according to schedule. At 4:11, the wire touched the cable. Through the glass, Caleb felt the hum of the current, like the buzzing of a mosquito. He exhaled and gave the command. The wire cut through the sheath, wrapped itself around the cable's conductors, and sparked an arc. The rim of the bowl went out completely, and all at once. And so began the longest night in the life of the living city. The dome did not flee. The dome could not flee. For 6 hours, it had to stand motionless in the darkness under the downpour, readjusting its own carrier frequency across the spectra laid out by Mara, while all around, the military camp, having lost its light, began to stir. Brix had mapped out these hours in advance, just as one maps out a battle. The first hour. Lights flicker on the ridge, and the starters of the backup generators roar. But the generators stall because that evening, Odo's people, passing by the camp with their wares, sold the Cora technicians canisters of diesel mixed with water. Odo had refused to fight even back when he was with Hayden, but a merchant knows how to fight without fighting. The second hour. Rem raises the alarm and orders the towers to be powered directly from the engine rooms. And 2 towers on the southern ridge do indeed come to life and fire blindly into the darkness of the basin. The dome shudders but holds its position because there are 2 beams, not 12. The third hour. Brix's group of 20 volunteers, with Brix himself at the forefront, emerges through the tunnel to the north, into the rear of the camp. They do not shoot at people. Following Garen's plan, they set fire not to the turrets, but to the spare rod warehouse and the oil tank for the generators. A fire during a thunderstorm is something that cannot be extinguished and yet must be put out. Half the camp battles the fire until morning. The fourth hour, the quietest and most terrifying. The dome recedes into the depths of the restructuring, and communication with Caleb thins to a thread. Caleb lies in the darkness among thousands of silent people, listening as the pulse of the building, which has become his very skin, grows fainter. Mara sits next to the chronometer, counting off the quarters of an hour aloud, and her voice is the only thing holding the hall together. The fifth hour. At the crest of the storm, the first backup generator kicks in. Then the second. The four towers come to life and begin scanning the bowl. Beams crawl across the dome, and the dome remains silent and unresponsive. And Caleb's heart stops, because he doesn't know whether this signifies the depth of the restructuring or its failure. The sixth hour. Just before dawn, the entire network comes to life. 12 beams intersect on the dome at full power, and nothing happens. The glass doesn't turn gray. The walls don't become viscous. The beams slide off the dome like rain off stone, and the telemetry in REM's lab module shows a flat zero response. The dome stands at the intersection of the 12 beams and slowly fills with light from within. It no longer drifts across the spectrum. Its carrier lies beyond the reach of the separators, and it modulates it freely, like a voice. The teenager died that night. Lan later recounted what happened in the module at that moment. Rem stared at the zero-point curves for 3 minutes without moving. Then she took off her goggles, placed them on the control panel, and told the blank screen that Valon's protocols had been exhausted, and that Valon had once again been proven right 100 years after his death. There was no rage in her voice. There was almost admiration in it, and that made it harder, not easier, because people like that don't give up, they just change their tools. The dome rose from the basin at dawn. It climbed the wide ramp toward the towers, and the towers fired at it point blank with everything they had, and it was like shining flashlights at a moving train. At the crest, it did what she and Caleb had agreed upon in advance, and what Caleb hadn't told anyone because he feared arguments. The dome stopped opposite the camp and extended a wide glass tongue from its lower tier, laying a gray plate the size of a gate on the ground in front of the Corps' vehicles. A dead piece of its own tissue, grown overnight specifically for this purpose. A gift and a message in one. Study the dead as much as you like. You can no longer take the living. And then the living city passed 100 meters from the camp without touching a single vehicle or a single person. And there was more power in that than in any blow. Cora's soldiers stood along the road and looked up at the transparent blocks floating past in the stormy dawn. And Lan said that some were taking off their helmets. The victory was complete. According to the laws of this world, the price for it came a day later and turned out to be the highest of all. First, Odo picked up a circular from Cora broadcast over the airwaves, sent to all the surviving enclaves in the district and beyond. In the circular, the enclave officially announced that it had identified the source of the acid rain. The source was identified as an uncontrolled bio-object known as the Glass City, whose emissions trigger storm fronts and pose a threat to all living things. Attached to the circular were fabricated spectra and photographs of the dome drinking the storm. The lie was cobbled together crudely, yet ingeniously, because it aligned with what people had seen with their own eyes. The dome was indeed drinking the rain. The dome was indeed growing from the storms. For the exhausted people throughout the region, the connection was obvious. By evening, the radio broadcast had yielded its first results. The settlement of Dunn, with which Odo had traded for 10 years, refused to accept the caravan coming from the Glass city. The Veer Enclave reported that they would fire on the dome if it came within 30 kilometers of their lands. The world they were trying to save had begun to fear them. And the second blow came from the very nature of their situation. Mara approached Caleb with growth calculations and stated plainly that, after the night of maturation, the dome had crossed the threshold. 1.5 million metric tons of living glass now demanded such a flow of organic matter and metal that not a single dead city in the district could sustain them for more than a month. Wandering from ruin to ruin meant eternal hunger and eternally terrorizing the settlements along the way. The city needed not a warehouse, but a source. A place where food isn't just lying around, but is constantly replenished. And Caleb, looking at the map, realized that there was only one such place on it: the coast. The dead Port Piran, with its endless warehouses and docks. The mouth of the great river carrying silt from the mainland and everything washed away by the rains. And the ocean. That very ocean where the TARS platform stood, birthing storms. To go and feed at the throat of disaster. When Lan heard the route, she turned pale and said that in Korvan, beneath the building of the old Botanical Institute, according to the Garden Project documents, was Valan's main laboratory, and that Rem knew this too. Caleb rolled up the map. All the roads of the world converged into one, and they were to travel along this road under a circular declaring them a plague. That night, during a thunderstorm, the dome cut off power to the network of towers, and during 6 hours of darkness, the dome reconfigured its carrier frequency, becoming impossible to jam, while Brix's group and Odo's cunning delayed the restoration of power. The city escaped the trap without touching the camp, landing Cora a dead specimen. In response, Kor sent a circular to all the enclaves declaring the dome the source of acid rain, and the settlements began to deny the city everything. The expanded dome now needs a renewable power source, and the city is heading toward the coast to the dead metropolis of Corvan, where the laboratory was located. The journey to the sea took 3 weeks and became a lesson in solitude for the city. The caravan traveled in an arc, bypassing inhabited settlements because Kor's circular had reached everywhere before they did. Mara later said that she remembered this journey through 4 vignettes, like a bad dream with vivid images. Vignette 1. The outpost of the Veer Enclave on a distant ridge, firing at the dome with a howitzer from past wars. The shells fell short, and the dome didn't even change course, while Caleb stood by the wall, watching the flashes and thinking that the people firing at them were the very ones they had invited to live beneath the domes. Scene 2. An abandoned village along the highway, where a pole stood in the square bearing a painted dome, a circled-out circle, and an inscription reading, "The plague is coming, it drinks the sky." Brix's scouts brought back a photograph of the pole, and Caleb forbade anyone from showing it to the people. Yet, of course, the people saw it that very same day. Scene 3. A night by the dead bridge across the Irna, when 50 ragged people from the vanished settlement emerged from the darkness toward the dome, knelt by the arch, and Caleb let them all in, noticing that half of them were crossing themselves as they gazed at the glowing fruits. To some, they were a plague, to others, a god. Both were lies, and both lies worked. Scene 4. The wall pass, beyond which the sea opened up. The city stood on the ridge, and 1,500 people pressed themselves against the southern walls and remained silent for a very long time. The sea was brown. All the way to the horizon, the water lay like dead lead, streaked with yellow foam, and above the distant line where the sky met the water stood an eternal, low glow, the color of copper. There, 300 kilometers from the shore, the TARS platform was operating and spawning fronts, and from here at the pass, its breadth was visible to the naked eye. And below the pass lay Corvan, a metropolis metropolis of 2 million pre-war residents sprawled across the river's mouth in gray, plateau-like neighborhoods. The downtown skyscrapers stood like melted candles. Port cranes lay in the water like skeletons, and across this entire lifeless expanse flowed the living Urna River, pushing silt and organic matter washed away from half the mainland out to sea. The dome, gazing at the estuary, trembled through the connection, a tremor born of hunger and anticipation, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Caleb sensed something resembling joy emanating from it. The city descended upon Corvin at dawn and entered the estuary port district and extended its tentacles into the docks, warehouses, and the rich silt of the estuary. And so began a week of great feasting, which Caleb once again remembered as a montage because it was impossible to live through it all at once. Tentacles as thick as houses devoured the silt, and the river carried in fresh supplies. The processing arches ground up entire rusty, dry cargo ships. The city grew by the block, and for the first time from Valana Hill, growth outpaced hunger. Mara, along with her crews, was setting up the first permanent farms on the renewable silt, and laughed that she was no longer designing a refuge, but a capital city. On the 6th day of the feast, Caleb took Lan and Mara and 24 of Brix's men and went to the center of the dead city to look for the Botanical Institute. The institute was found on Academy's Boulevard, recognizable by the dilapidated greenhouse on the roof. The staircases leading down were still intact. The doors to the level -3 laboratory had been forced open long ago and roughly, and inside, everything had been stripped down to the walls. Lan said it bore the corporation's signature and that Rem had likely been here years ago, even before the rains. But Valan was a man of the last century, and Lan knew that such people had one weakness: paper. The safes containing the samples had been taken, but no one had touched the bookshelf with the work notebooks in the caretaker's back room because, to the corporation, notebooks aren't data. For 3 nights, Caleb and Lan read the notebooks by the light of a glowing fruit they'd brought with them, and on the 3rd night, the picture of the world came together completely and turned out to be bigger and more terrifying than any of their guesses. Valan didn't just predict Tars's disaster. Valan had designed an emergency system for TARS, but the corporation rejected it on cost grounds, so he built his own solution using decommissioned funds in a remote province. The greenhouse on the hill was not a prototype for a shelter, it was the seed of a cure. In his final notebooks, Valan described the mature phase of an organism, which he called the garden phase. A mature organism that has reached the shoreline and received unlimited nourishment is capable of releasing a root colony into the ocean. The colony will travel along the seafloor to the source of contamination, entwine itself around it, and digest it, just as the dome digests acid, because Tars's reactor creatures of Tars and the dome's flesh are bred from the same lineage, and the dome is their elder brother and predator. There's no need to endure the rains. The rains can be turned off. To initiate the garden phase, one condition is required, which Valan emphasized 3 times: the interface's complete trust. A person fused with the organism must surrender to it, for the duration of the phase, the full depth of the connection without reservation. And Valan wrote honestly that he did not know whether the interface would return from such an immersion as it was before, or whether it would return at all. Caleb closed the last notebook and looked at his forearm, where an old scar had long since been entwined with thin glass threads all the way up to his elbow. The price had been written 100 years ago, specifically for him. He didn't have time to either decide or be frightened, because on the morning of the 4th day, ships entered Corvin Harbor. 3 low gray hulls flying the flag of Cora anchored in the roadstead, out of reach, and following them down the southern highway into the city was a convoy that bricks, from the roof, declared to be all that remained of the Enclave. And at noon, Rem spoke over the public channel, and what she said was not an ultimatum. She said she was withdrawing all previous demands, that over the past month, the Enclave had lost 2 of its 5 residential levels to the front lines, and that her mathematicians had calculated the underground complex had 8 months left, that she had read Valon's notebooks before Caleb did, and knew about the garden phase, which was why she was now standing in the roadstead rather than firing. That once a generation, TARS releases a unified front, and according to all the colony's data, the next release is gathering right now, and will be so powerful that neither concrete nor glass, neither living nor dead, will withstand it. And that she's offering neither peace nor an alliance, but a deal among the doomed. The entire fleet, all of Cora's armor, and all of its laboratories will cover the dome on its way to the platform and assist in launching the garden phase. In return, after victory, the Enclave will gain access to Valon's technology, because otherwise its people won't survive another year. She fell silent, and in the pause, Caleb heard through his external sensors what the dome had been sensing for an hour, but could not name. From the south, beyond the coppery glow, a pressure wave was moving across the dead water. Not yet a storm, the lull before the storm. On the horizon, above the waterline, the glow of TARS was slowly swelling into a dome of murky light, growing and showing no sign of stopping. The platform was gathering strength for the greatest eruption of its existence, and between that eruption and the 1,500 people stood the only building on Earth capable of drinking in the sky. Caleb placed his palm on a supporting vein and felt how, as if beneath glass, a life, both foreign and familiar, beated steadily and powerfully, ready to plunge into the water. He picked up the microphone and told Rem that negotiations would begin that evening, and that they would not be discussing access to the technology, but rather the people at its various levels, whom the dome would accept just as it had accepted the people of Garen. The sea beyond the walls heaved heavily for the first time. There was time for exactly one decision, and that decision would cost Caleb either his life or his very self. The city passed through a district that had become hostile due to the circular, and entered the dead coastal metropolis of Corvin, where the river's mouth provided a renewable food source, and growth had, for the first time, outpaced famine. In Valon's notebooks from the ransacked laboratory, the garden phase was revealed. A mature dome can release a root colony into the ocean that will digest the TARS platform and shut down the rains. But to activate it, Caleb must surrender the full depth of his connection to the dome, at the risk of never returning as himself. Cora's forces arrived at the harbor, and Rem, aware of the garden phase, proposed a deal of the doomed, since her enclave was perishing, and TARS was currently preparing a combined super emission. Caleb scheduled negotiations, demanding that Cora's people be admitted under the domes. The negotiations began in the evening, and the first thing Caleb put on the table was not a map, but a list. Garen had compiled it in 3 hours, and it was the best list ever created by a man who specialized in lists. A roll call of the residents of Cora's underground levels. 4,200 people, including children born underground who had never seen the sky. Caleb told Rem that he would only discuss the platform after these 4,000 were granted the right to enter the vaults, regardless of the outcome of the expedition. Not as a payment, as a condition under which he was even willing to risk his own life. Rem stared at the list for a long time. Then she took off her glasses, and Lan, standing by the wall, tensed up because she recognized that gesture. Rem said she prepared 12 bargaining chips for the negotiations, and that the overseer's list had rendered them all worthless because he'd asked for the one thing she couldn't help but give up: her own people. She was the first to sign the protocol. For 3 weeks afterward, the harbor of Corvin lived as no port in history had ever lived. Two enemies were organizing a single expedition. Mara, along with Corps engineers, calculated the load on the dome's arches while moving along the seabed and double-checked the figures 3 times because the bottom of the estuary was silt, while the bottom of the open sea was rock. Brix, along with Captain Cern, who still hadn't learned to say more than 10 words a day, drafted the expedition orders, in which the gray ships would sail in wings flanking the dome. Odo set up a supply fair on the waterfront and traded with both armies at once, as happy as a merchant on the day when all the trade routes converge. Garen received the first convoys of settlers from the Cora levels, and for the first time in his life, his list served not to keep people out, but to welcome them. And Caleb was preparing for his own. Velen's notebooks instructed the interface, before the garden phase, to gradually increase the depth of the connection, just as a diver increases his depth. Every night he gave the dome an extra hour of himself, and every morning he returned more and more slowly. After the 5th night, he couldn't remember Mara's name for an hour, and hid it. After the 7th, he spoke to Brix in a language that didn't exist, and didn't notice it. He couldn't hide it anymore because Brix reported it to Mara, and Mara came to Caleb, sat down silently across from him, and stayed there until he told her everything himself. She didn't try to talk him out of it. She was an engineer and understood that there was no other bridge between people and TARS. She only made him draw up a return protocol with Lan. Anchors, as Lan called them, a collection of things, words, and faces that would hold fast, deep down, what remained of Caleb as a human being. They gathered a few anchors. The key to the old greenhouse, which he'd carried in his pocket from day one. The scent of barley from the first garden bed. Mara's voice counting off a quarter of an hour on the night of the restructuring. And one phrase he asked to be repeated to him over the comm every hour of the descent. The phrase was simple. "They're waiting for you up there." Meanwhile, the sea was changing color. The coppery glow in the south had swelled over the past 3 weeks to fill half the sky, and at night, silent flashes flickered within it. The reconnaissance ship Cora, which had traveled 100 kilometers to the platform, returned with recordings that even Cern remained silent about. TARS was no longer a platform. Over the years, the colonies had built a living mountain a kilometer high on its supports, and the mountain was breathing. It drew in the sea and exhaled acidic vapor into the stratosphere, and the rhythm of its breathing quickened week after week, like labor contractions. The REM mathematicians agreed on a timeline of 20 days until the main eruption. The expedition was scheduled without waiting for preparations to be completed. The city set out to sea at dawn on the 31st day of its stay, and Caleb remembered the previous evening down to the minute because he suspected it would be the last time he'd remember it. He walked through all the quarters of the dome. He stood by the first row of the old hall, where barley with a glassy sheen was still growing. He sat in the station hall, where Garen taught children from the Cora levels to read the clouds through the transparent dome. On the upper tier, he found Lan, who, by the light of the fruit, was rereading Velen's notebooks for the 100th time. Without looking up, she said that in the last notebook, the professor had addressed the future interface directly, and that Caleb should read it himself rather than through a retelling. Caleb read it. Velen wrote, a century later, to a stranger, asking for forgiveness for the price he had set for the project without consulting the payer, and that he had left deep within the organism a gift that cannot be described in words because words belong to the surface, and that this gift would reveal itself only at the very bottom of the descent and only to those who went there of their own free will. In the morning, the city entered the sea. The ark stepped from the embankment to the bottom of the harbor, and the water rose up to the lower tiers of the dome. The people, clinging to the walls, saw a mass of dead, brown water flow past the transparent walls. The dome moved along the seabed just as it had moved across land, only more slowly, and its veins drank up the silt and the residue of sunken tankers and the acid in the water itself. The gray ships of Korra stood like wings on either side. The fleet of the doomed moved south toward the breathing mountain, and behind the stern, the shore faded away, leaving behind the empty Corvin. On the third day of the journey, the sea around them grew hot. On the fifth day, the first living creatures of Tars appeared in the water. Blind, gelatinous masses the size of a house were carried by the current toward the shore, and the dome caught them with its tendrils as it moved, devouring them. And Caleb sensed through the connection that with every creature consumed, not only strength, but also knowledge flowed into the dome. Tars's flesh carried within it a map of Tars. The dome consumed the intelligence. By the end of the first week of the voyage, the fleet had reached a boundary 50 kilometers from the platform, beyond which the ships could not go because the water there would corrode even their hulls within hours. From there on, the dome proceeded alone. The night before crossing the boundary, Caleb gathered everyone in the station hall and spoke briefly. He said he would be heading into the depths of communication that morning, and that, until the end of the phase, the council would be in command of the city. Mara would handle the dome. Brix would handle defense. Garen would handle the people. Rem and Lan would handle science. Odo would handle everything that could be bought and sold. He said that if he returned not as himself, he asked that they speak patiently to whoever returned, because that person would also remember them as best they could. Then he asked everyone to disperse, remained alone, and placed both palms on the supporting vein. The dome awaited him. Beyond the wall, in the hot darkness, the sea churned, and far to the south, the mountain that had destroyed the old world breathed. Caleb closed his eyes and stepped inside. Caleb had bargained with Rem to admit all 4,000 inhabitants of the dying enclave beneath the vaults, and for 3 weeks the enemies prepared a joint campaign. Caleb deepened his connection, losing himself at the edges, and together with Lan and Mara, he created anchors for his return, while Velen's notebooks promised a certain gift at the bottom of the descent. Tars had turned into a living, breathing mountain, and there were about 20 days left until the main eruption. The fleet had reached the final frontier, 50 kilometers from the platform. Beyond that lay only the dome. Caleb handed over authority to the council and began a complete immersion into the connection. The descent was unlike either a dream or death, and afterward, Caleb could find no words to describe it except for one: expansion. First, the body vanished. It didn't vanish. It simply ceased to be a boundary. He was the palms on a vein, and he was the vein itself, and he was all the veins at once, and the floor of the station hall, and roots in hot water, and the walls against which the night wave crashed. 1,500 hearts pounded within him like rain pounding on the dome. He heard Mara speaking into the microphone upstairs for the first quarter of an hour, and her voice was an anchor, and the anchor held. Then the dome's memory unfolded, and Caleb realized that 100 years of solitude was not a metaphor. He had lived through them. A century beneath the dust on the hill, a slow starvation, fallen leaves once a year as his only food, a half-sleep in which the seed of the medicine awaited the illness for which it was created, fearing it might sleep through it. And he relived that first night of rain from the other side, like a long-awaited feast, and like terror at his own awakening, and like amazement at the small, fiery creature that had entered beneath the dome, whose blood on the glass suddenly made loneliness not eternal. The dome remembered his arrival as a miracle. All this time, they had been a miracle to one another. On the second day of the descent, the city moved beyond the border, and Caleb was already guiding it from within. He was the city. He rearranged the arches across the stone floor and felt the rocky ridges beneath his soles. He caught the veins of gelatinous creatures and dissected their flesh for knowledge. The water around him thickened with acid, warming and nourishing him, and he grew as he moved, extending new traction tendrils along his sides in preparation for what lay ahead. 20 kilometers from the platform, the seabed began to rise. Mount Tarsa began underwater, with scree of its own shed flesh, and the dome stepped onto this scree, and Caleb sensed the enemy in its taste. Velan had been right. Tarsa's flesh was the flesh of the dome, only feral, blind, growing without purpose, just as a tumor grows. The colonies were not evil. They were a garden that no one had weeded for 100 years. And deep within their senseless swarming, Caleb detected something that none of Korra's instruments had recorded: a rhythm, a common beat to which all the mountain's colonies were subject. The feral garden had a center, the core of the old platform where the project's control reactor had once stood, and from which now emanated the rhythm that made the mountain breathe and accumulate emissions. To stop the breathing, there was no need to dig through a kilometer-high mountain. One had to reach the heart and intercept the beat. On the fourth day, the dome began its ascent, and a battle began that those above only became aware of through the tremors of the walls. The mountain sensed a foreign rhythm within its body and responded. The scree beneath the arches came to life and seized hold of the supports. From the slopes, tendrils of blind flesh as thick as a tower surged forth, wrapping around the dome and attempting not to destroy it, but to devour it, to draw it into the collective swarm, just as the mountain absorbed everything. The dome burned from within with its own light, slicing through the strands and devouring them. And what it devoured became part of it, not the mountain. And meter by meter, the transparent city crept upward along the enemy's body, transforming it into itself along the way. Caleb was all of this, every cut, every gulp, and every span of the ascent. The anchors held fast. Once an hour, through the roar of battle, Mara's voice reached him, telling him they were waiting for him at the top, and he clung to those words as if to a handrail. But the depths took their toll. By the 5th day, he had forgotten his own face. By the 6th day, he remembered only that there were those waiting above, and that waiting had a voice. On the 7th day, the dome reached the mountain's summit, where the core breathed within a crater of living flesh, and it stopped before the final step, because that final step was not for him, it was for Caleb. The core's rhythm could not be overridden by force. Force only gave rise to convulsions within the mountain and a new wave of swarming. The rhythm could be altered only by one capable of offering the swarm a different plan, a meaningful one. The swarm knew no words, but the swarm knew how to listen to the connection, and the connection was the human side of the dome, that very interface for which Velan had incorporated blood into the project. And here, at the bottom of the descent, a gift from the last notebook revealed itself. Caleb stepped into the rhythm of the core and did not dissolve, because at the very depths of the dome's structure, beneath all the layers of glass and memory, he found a room left for him. Not an image, but a real room. The old botanist's study, with a wooden table, a cup of cold tea, and a window overlooking the garden. There was no one at the table, but the room remembered its owner in such detail that it remembered for him. Velan hadn't lived to see his war, and had left a cast of himself in the seed, not a soul, nor a recording, but a way of thinking. A way of thinking. The century-old, stubborn kindness of a man who built a cure, knowing he would never see a recovery. And this way of thinking fell upon Caleb as naturally as a tool fits a hand. Together with the room, he fell into the rhythm of the core. He didn't break the beat, he sang along with it. Through every vein of the dome, a new rhythm swarmed forth, woven from everything the dome knew about life among people. The beating of 1,500 hearts, children's laughter on the warm floor, the counting of quarter hours in Mara's voice, the rhythm of garden beds, harvests, and communal dinners, a plan instead of swarming, a garden instead of a tumor, and the mountain heard. Its breath faltered. The gathering eruption faltered faltered halfway to the sky. A wave of rebirth swept down the kilometer-long slopes, just as green waves had once swept across the dome, only this wave was the size of a mountain range. The feral colonies, tier by tier, caught the new rhythm, subsided, and began to reorganize. Up above, at the 50-kilometer mark, people saw a coppery glow flicker on the horizon, for the first time in 5 years. And then, from the south across the water, came a sound that no one had ever heard before. A long, descending moan of 1,000 organ pipes. Mount Tars exhaled the final acidic breath of its former life. It exhaled not into the stratosphere, but into the water at its feet, where the newborn roots of the dome were already waiting to drink it in. On the 8th day, everything ended and everything began. The rhythm of the core belonged to the dome. The mountain breathed in a new rhythm, and with each breath it no longer poisoned the sky, but purified the water around itself. The garden phase had taken place. The rains were shut off at their source. And in the station hall of the living city of Mara, she stood over Caleb's body, which had lain there for 7 days with his palms resting on his veins, and saw his eyelids twitch. He opened his eyes. The eyes were his. The gaze was not quite his own. He looked at her for a long time and intently, the way one looks at a very important word rolling around on one's tongue. Then he said slowly, enunciating each word clearly, that her name was Mara, and that she had counted a quarter of an hour for him. And he asked, in his own voice, but with a stranger's deep silence within, whether it was true that they had been waiting for him here. Mara wept and said it was true. Beyond the city walls, clouds were dispersing over the Dead Sea. Fully immersed, Caleb became the city, lived through the dome's century-old memory, and led it to storm the living mountain of Tarsus, which turned out to be the dome's feral kin, devoid of design. At the bottom of his descent, a gift from Valan was revealed, a cast of his training, and with its help, Caleb did not break, but reworked the rhythm of the core, conveying the garden's design to the swarm. The mountain ceased to poison the sky, and fell in step with the dome's rhythm, and the main emission was extinguished. The rains were shut off at their source. Caleb returned to his body alive, but changed, with a foreign silence within him, and unable to recall people right away. Caleb's return took neither a day nor a week, and the city learned to live alongside the one who had returned. At first, he remained silent for days on end, and would stand for long periods with his palm on the vein, and Mara learned to distinguish between these moments of stillness. Sometimes he simply basked in the connection, as if it were a stove. Sometimes he would delve deep into it, and then he could not be disturbed, because during those hours he was guiding the mountain. Tars, 1,000 kilometers away, was now part of his body, just as the dome had once become, and he tended the reborn colonies as a shepherd tends a vast, slow-moving herd. Words returned to him in layers. First, the names of the anchors, then the names of the council, then the entire language, all at once one morning, when he came out for breakfast and asked for barley porridge, and joked about its timeless taste, and half the hall wept over their bowls. But the alien silence within him remained for good, and he learned to live with it as one lives with a new organ. He now always heard more than was spoken. Meanwhile, the world was discovering that the sky had changed. The REM meteorologists were the first to record it. Fronts from the south continued by inertia for another 2 weeks, each weaker than the last, and on the 17th day after the garden phase, rain fell over the former coastline for the first time in 5 years. Rain that didn't make the earth smoke, just plain, bitter water. People emerged from beneath the vaults to stand in the rain, tilting their heads back, and Bricks, who hadn't shed a tear through 2 wars, stood there longer than anyone else. The radio broadcast the news throughout the districts and beyond, and the world didn't believe it right away, but once they did, they asked who had done it. And here, Rem did something no one expected of her, except, perhaps, Lan. She went on the air across all the Enclave's frequencies with an official report and declassified the entire Garden Project archive. The TARS accident, the corporation's guilt, and the circular containing the lie about the glass plague, which she herself had signed, and the full report on the garden phase, naming the overseer, Caleb Dan, and Professor Oren Vallon. She concluded by saying that science must be able to acknowledge not only discoveries, but also crimes, and that she intended to spend the rest of her life making amends for this. The airwaves were silent for an hour, and then the districts erupted. Cora's lies died in a single day, and with them, the fear of the transparent city died. First came a radio transmission from Vera, the very same one that had fired a howitzer at the dome. They did not apologize out of pride, but asked to send a delegation to discuss water issues. Behind them came Dunn. Behind them came settlements that even Odo had never known about. The dead zone around the living city turned into a road, and people set out along it. The city welcomed everyone and grew, and its growth was no longer a flight from hunger. The estuary provided sustenance. Day after day, the mountain to the south released into the sea not poison, but a processed suspension, from which the first living greenery appeared in the dead water by the second month. The planet did not need to be saved in its entirety and all at once. It needed to be repaired from one end, and that end had been chosen. That same fall, 3 events occurred that Caleb later called seams. The first seam was the trial of the past that the city staged for itself, because the new times demanded a reckoning with the old. It was not people who were on trial, but decisions. For 3 days in the station hall, in full view of everyone, they examined Garen's blockade, the storming of bricks, Rem's circular, Odo's deals, and Caleb's own decisions, including the night he led the city into a trap without consulting it. No one was executed or exiled. For each decision, they recorded the cost and the lesson learned. And Garen, to everyone's surprise, was the first to stand up and say, looking over his lists, that the man who had confused the city with himself was asking permission to continue serving the city as a simple accountant. They granted his request. The second stitch was the Constitution, which the entire city spent a month drafting, and whose first clause stated that a living city is a union of 2 beings, humans and the dome, and that neither of them is the property of the other. The dome listened to the reading through Caleb, and a green wave swept through all the halls. It was recorded in the minutes as a signature. The third stitch was the wedding. Mara proposed herself because Caleb, with his newfound silence, would have taken another year to do so. Odo married them, as in days of old, being the only person with the gift of speaking solemnly and briefly. The dome raised an arch of glowing fruit above them, and the whole city ate barley flatbreads, while Brix and Cern got drunk like 2 sergeants from every war combined, and sang songs in unison through their silence. And in winter, the last shadow of the old world arrived. From the north, from distant enclaves known only by rumor, negotiators with cold eyes arrived and offered Caleb what they called a partnership. Their lands lay far from the deactivated TARS, and the rain scarcely reached them, but they weren't interested in the rain. They were interested in the seed. They asked for, bought, or demanded Vallon's technology for themselves, their own domes, their own living fortresses under their own control. And when Caleb refused, explaining that the dome was not a technology, but a living being, and that a living being was not for sale, they left without arguing. Through the silence within, Caleb sensed that they had not left in defeat, but to make plans. The council expected him to sound the alarm, but he gathered everyone and said calmly that the old world would continue to test them for many more years, and that the city had only one answer, and it was already growing. He led the council out onto the southern gallery and pointed downward. At the foot of the city, in the warmed earth of the former Corvin, a green shoot with a glassy sheen was rising from the silt, the dome's first free offspring, a seed that the city had chosen to give of its own free will, planting it not within the fortress, but in the earth. Velen had been crafting a remedy for the catastrophe. The remedy had worked. Now it was about to become simply life, and life could neither be stolen nor bought, for from now on it was growing everywhere. Caleb stood over the chute with Mara and sensed through their connection how far to the south the former mountain of death breathed in a steady rhythm. And deep within the dome, a room with an old table and cooled tea glowed quietly. One last great task lay ahead, and Caleb remained silent about it for now. The dome had shown it to him in a dream of their shared depths, the place where it all began. Valana Hill, above the dissolved Hayden, where, unnoticed by anyone, over the course of a year, a second shoot had risen from the abandoned roots. Wild, lonely, waiting, just as the seed had once waited beneath a century's worth of dust. The city was bound to return, and Caleb knew that with this return, history would come full circle. The rains had stopped, and Rem publicly exonerated Kor, restoring the city's good name, after which the counties began to join the Union. The city held a trial regarding the decisions of the past, adopted a constitution for the union of people and the dome, and Caleb and Mara were married. The northern enclaves attempted to obtain the dome's technology. After leaving, they harbored secret plans, but the city responded by freely sowing its own offspring into the warmed earth. On Valana Hill, a wild, solitary shoot sprouted from the old roots, and the city decided to return to its place of origin to come full circle. The city journeyed home all spring, and the road back bore no resemblance to the road there. A year ago, it had fled through these lands under the fire of circular cannons and howitzers. Now the migration had turned into a procession through a recovering region, and Mara, out of habit, committed it to memory in 4 scenes. Image 1. The Urna River Valley, where the people of Veer stood along the banks with buckets, asking not for food, but for glass cuttings, and Garen distributed them according to lists, and for the first time, the lists ran out before the line did, without a single argument. Image 2. A nighttime stop at the former outpost, where that very howitzer stood, entwined with the first wild greenery, and Vera's artillerymen sheepishly showed Bricks how they had converted the shell crates into seedling trays. Scene 3. The crossroads of old highways, where Odo solemnly drove a post into the ground, with signposts pointing to the 4 cardinal directions, and declared that the roots were alive, and therefore, so was the world. Scene 4. The ridge from which the former Hayden came into view. The city stood on the ridge and fell silent, just as it had fallen silent over the sea a year ago. Hayden was gone. There was the green bowl of the valley. The rains had washed the city away to its very foundations, and the very first clear spring arrived on the mineral-enriched earth and burst forth with grass as tall as a man. And in the midst of this unfamiliar, lush greenery stood Valana Hill, and on the hill, a solitary shoot, already as tall as a tree, glowed with a glassy sheen. The dome trembled throughout its entire body via the connection, and Caleb did not immediately understand what his giant was feeling. Then he understood. This is how one trembles before meeting a child one has never seen. They descended slowly, and Caleb walked the last few kilometers on foot ahead of the city, just as he had walked alone toward Korra's column a year ago. The chute on the hill sensed them long before they approached. This wild offspring had grown from the roots torn away when the dome took its first step, and had lived all year just as the seed of Valan had once lived, alone, on a meager ration, not knowing what he was. Only this one had been denied even human blood and human warmth, and so he grew up wary, like a young beast. When the dome's shadow fell upon the hill, the sapling bristled with glassy needles all along its trunk, and Caleb heard its cry through the link, not malice, the terror of the small in the face of the immense. And then the city did what neither Caleb nor the council had suggested, but the dome itself. It stopped. It lowered its arches a kilometer from the hill, froze, and withdrew all its power from the connection, leaving only warmth, and it began to wait. They waited 9 days. For 9 days, the city stood in the green valley without moving a step, and people went about their ordinary lives, and children played in the grass beneath the walls, while Caleb climbed the hill alone every morning and sat on the old foundation, a step away from the barbed wire-covered chute, and spoke to it aloud. He told it everything in order, about the distribution of the shelters and Inspector Holt's key, about the first night of rain and the blood on the glass, about Yarvis and Mara and Odo and the network of 12 towers, about the sea and the mountain and the room with the cold tea. The chute listened, its thorns receded by 1 per day. On the 9th morning, when Caleb climbed the hill, the needles were gone. The escape stood smooth and warm, and at the level of a human hand, a small glass branch arched out from the trunk. Caleb placed his palm on it, and the connection closed. A new voice joined the city's collective rhythm, thin, timid, deafeningly young. The dome, the father, and the chute, the son, began to sing to each other across the hill at a frequency that made the hairs on everyone's arms stand on end, and Mara said it was the first time she'd ever heard a building cry with happiness. The decision regarding the hill's fate was made by the entire city, and the outcome was not what Caleb had expected. He had expected the city to want to stay, to settle in this place of power, by the clear water in the finest valley in the county. The city decided otherwise, and oddly enough, it was Bricks who first put it into words. He said that a fortress that settles on the ground forever becomes a fortress once more, and that the world is too vast and ailing for the best doctor to remain in the finest valley. The city decided not to stay. The city decided to leave. Valana Hill, with its young dome, was declared the Union's first free settlement. Those wishing to settle signed up with Garin, and 400 people, led by farming families and an elderly instrument maker, had signed up within the first week. The city gave the young dome a dowry, a third of its supplies, a library containing copies of all of Valana's notebooks, and an anchor. The young structure needed someone of its own blood, and that person found her own way to it. Lon came to Caleb that evening and said that she had spent her whole life studying other people's projects and wanted to nurture her own for once. The next morning, she was the first person to place her hand on a branch of the young dome, and Caleb felt through the connection as a new pair was formed. The separation ceremony was scheduled for midsummer, and it became a celebration unlike anything the New World had ever seen. Delegations from 8 settlements gathered. Odo opened the fair. Rem brought a gift from the Enclave that left even him speechless. Dismantled resonance towers remelted into bells. 12 bells, cast from the metal of the former capcans, were hung along the galleries of the old dome, and at noon they rang for the first time. The dome resonated with the sound throughout its entire structure, and the valley sang for an hour. And at sunset, the city bid farewell to the hill. The 400 who remained stood on the slope by the young dome, which by summer had risen to the height of a 2-story house. The 1,500 who were leaving stood by the walls of the old one. Caleb spoke a few brief words. He said that 100 years ago, one stubborn man had planted a seed here against the end of the world, and that the end of the world had lost. That from here, the seed had gone out into the world and returned here as a son, and that it would always be so now, because life had learned from people the most important human task, to leave something behind. The town set off into the twilight. The young dome glowed on the hill with a warm green light and rang out after the departing father with its first bell, cast by an old bell maker from the bronze frames of that very same century-old greenhouse. The old dome answered with 12 chimes. Caleb stood by the south wall with Mara and listened to the call and response across the night valley until the hill faded away behind them. Ahead to the south lay the estuary and the capital's construction site, along with the northern delegation with their cold eyes and all the endless work of a world on the mend. He thought this was the finale of their story and was wrong for the last time. The finale awaited him a month later at home in Corvin, and it came neither as a misfortune nor as an enemy. On a warm September night, a connection roused Caleb. The dome was calling him down to the oldest supporting vein of the first hall. It was calling in an unusual way, quietly and almost shyly. Caleb descended into the sleeping hall, placed his palm on the vein, and the dome revealed to him what it had been preparing all summer, in secret even from him. Deep within the supporting vein, behind a layer of centuries-old glass, Velen's room glowed. Only now, the room was not empty. Behind the wooden table, opposite the empty host's chair, the dome had created a second chair, simple, sturdy, tailored to the build and height of one specific person. The dome could not speak in words, but Caleb understood the invitation as clearly as he had ever understood anything in his life. Someday, very far in the future, when the caretaker's body grew weary, a place would be ready for him here. Not death. To be continued. Just as Velen had remained an apprentice in the seed, so Caleb would be able to remain in what they had grown together. The house offered him eternity and gave him time to answer. Caleb stood for a long time in the dark hall. Then he ran his hand over the warm glass and said aloud that he would think about it in 50 years. And he went upstairs where Mara was sleeping, because until eternity, he was destined to live. The city returned through the recovering district to Valana Hill, where a wild, frightened shoot had sprung from the old roots, and after 9 days of Caleb's patience, they tamed it, after which the father dome and the son were united by a bond. The city decided not to settle there, but to establish the first free settlement on the hill, leaving 400 residents, provisions, and land as the anchor of the young dome. At the farewell celebration, Rem presented bells recast from the resonance towers. As a farewell, the old dome showed Caleb a second chair, grown deep within, in Valan's room, an invitation to one day stay there forever, and Caleb postponed his answer for decades, choosing life instead. 26 years passed, and the world ceased to remember itself as dying. Many recorded the history of those years in the capital of the Union, but Caleb always told it to his grandchildren in 4 segments out of an old nomadic habit. Segment 1, the 5th year. The ocean off the coast of what used to be Tars bloomed with lush greenery, and the fishermen of Corvin set out to fish for the first time, while the former Mountain of Death became an underwater garden where young people swam to gaze at the glowing groves. The second segment, the 11th year. Across the land stretching from the sea to the northern borders, 40 young domes now stood, each having grown from a seed given voluntarily, and each had its own human anchor, its own name, and its own bell. The northern enclaves, with their cold eyes, held out in isolation for 8 years, and then their people simply began leaving for the domes in families, and the rulers of the north came to negotiate themselves, because you cannot wage war against those to whom your children are fleeing. Third chapter, the 18th year. The first universal ringing, when at noon on the equinox all the domes of the earth rang out at once, transmitting the wave to one another through the network, and the wave circled the mainland in an hour. And the elders said they heard in that ringing the voices of all those they had lost in the rains. Scene 4, the 26th year, this autumn. The capital at the river's mouth had expanded, with transparent neighborhoods on both banks, and the old dome at its heart had long since ceased to wage war against anyone, devoting itself instead to the purpose for which it was built. It nurtured. It taught the young domes through the connection. It drank the rare, pure rains simply for the taste. People of those years came and went. Garin lived to see the 12th year and died in his sleep over the fresh census lists, and the entire Union mourned him. Yet, on his tombstone, in accordance with his will, only the word accountant was carved. Odo, in his 15th year, passed on the routes to his sons and settled at the capital's fair as a storyteller, lying to his grandchildren about past expeditions so passionately that Brix would come to listen and correct him. Brix himself, along with Cern, ran a school for rescuers and raised 3 generations of those who are the first to rush into any danger. Rem worked until the very last day of the 19th year and accomplished what mattered most. Her institute at the Dome had learned to revive barren lands without the Dome seeds, simply through skilled work with soil and water, and she died knowing that the planet would now recover no matter what. Her laboratory was taken over by Lan, who came from Valon Hill once a year, aged and serene, and her young dome was now considered the kindest home in the north. Mara had been building the capital for a quarter of a century, and this spring she told Caleb that for the first time in her life she had no unfinished bridge, and that this, it turned out, was happiness. And Caleb was aging strangely, and he knew why. Glass threads had long since entwined him up to his shoulder, and through that connection the years flowed through him more slowly than through others, but they flowed nonetheless. He was nearing 60, and his body was beginning to grow weary, just as houses that have stood for a century grow weary. Honestly, rightfully so. And that fall, on the anniversary of the first rain, he realized that the time had come for his final task. He didn't tell anyone in advance except Mara. Mara listened in silence and looked at him for a long time, and then asked only one thing. Was he sure this wasn't an escape from old age, but rather the road home? Caleb replied that he'd been testing himself for 26 years, and that there were 2 armchairs in the room downstairs, not just one, and that the dome would grow a second one by her hand when she herself wanted it, and if she wanted it, and that no one would ever rush her, because that was what this whole story had taught them. Everything that lives comes of its own accord, or doesn't come at all. He stretched out his farewell for a year, and that year turned out to be the best of his life. He traveled to all 40 domes, living in each one for a week, and to each new building he recounted aloud the entire story, from Inspector Holt's key to that very day, because he wanted the memory to live on not as a record, but as a story. He took his grandchildren to Velen Hill and showed them the foundation of the old greenhouse and the bell made of bronze frames. He went out with the fishermen one last time to the underwater gardens of Tars and dipped his hand into the warm, living water that had once dissolved stone. Together with Lan, he finished writing the last notebook, not Valana's, his own, for the next interface, for which, someday, some dome somewhere on Earth would be chosen. As the first line of the notebook, he wrote that the dome is neither a tool nor a master, but a second voice in the conversation, and that this conversation is the cure for all the ends of the world. And on a warm September night, exactly 27 years after the inspector had laughingly handed him the key to the ruin, Caleb descended into the first hall. The city slept. Mara walked with him to the main vein, and they stood there embracing. She said she would come in time, and that the tea in the room shouldn't get cold. The dome awaited him just as it had on that first rainy night, only now the anticipation held no hunger or loneliness. A room was ready. Caleb placed both palms on the vein, just as he had placed one bloodied palm there 27 years ago. The connection opened up to its full depth, and this time, he did not cling to the anchors. He let go. The expansion was familiar and easy, like returning to the orphanage where you remember every floorboard. He passed through layers of glass and memory, past a century of loneliness, and the night of the first rain, and all the roads and battles and bells, and entered the room that smelled of old paper and the garden outside the window. Someone was now sitting in the host's armchair. Not a figure, nor a ghost, but a presence. A century-old, stubborn kindness turned its attention to him from the eternal records and pushed a cup toward him. The tea in the cup was hot. Caleb sat down in the second armchair on his right and felt the body above him quietly and gratefully drift off to sleep, while he himself remained, not as a memory, nor as an echo, as a lesson, a way of thinking. The one who, together with the room's first owner, would teach every new seed the most important thing: patience, kindness, and that what you leave behind is more important than what you possess. In the morning, the city awoke to the sound of bells. The old dome rang out with all 12 of its bells, not alarmingly, but solemnly, and the younger domes picked up the wave across the land, and people stepped out beneath the arches and understood without words. The caretaker went inside the house. Mara stood by the supporting vane, placing her palm on the warm glass, and through the glass, a green wave settled on her palm from within, cautious, familiar, alive. She smiled through her tears and said she understood and that the tea could wait. A clear sun was rising over the capital. Through the transparent neighborhoods, children who had never seen an acid-stained sky ran to school. At the river's mouth, seagulls that had returned for the 4th year in a row were crying out. And deep within the heart of the old dome, in a room with a window overlooking the eternal garden, 2 gardeners, one from the last century and one from this one, were drinking tea and listening as bells cast from snares rang out again and again across the entire healed earth. The story of how a man came to possess the key to the ruins had ended. The story of the garden now continued on its own, and it no longer needed a narrator, for it had everything a living thing could need: earth, sky, time, and those who wait for one another. In 26 years, the world had recovered. 40 young domes grew from voluntarily donated seeds. The North surrendered without a war. The ocean near Tars became a garden, and Caleb's comrades lived out their lives, leaving behind schools, roots, and science. An aging Caleb bid farewell to the world after spending a year traveling to all the domes and writing a notebook for future interfaces, after which he voluntarily into the depths of the dome, taking the second chair in Velen's room, and remained there as a teacher and mentor to all future seeds. Mara promised to come in time.